Hello, welcome to my Zoom tutorial on how to teach online piano lessons using Zoom. I've been doing this since the start of the pandemic, which was a surprise for my studio, and we had to immediately switch to online lessons. Luckily, I've been able to figure out pretty quickly some tricks and some ways of teaching that have made the transition easier for my students. So this tutorial is to show those things I've learned. Just a little bit of information. I teach primarily young kids and beginners. So I teach kids mostly ages 4 to 12, with a few teenagers as well. But because I mostly teach young students, this is geared more towards that kind of learning environment. When I teach on my laptop. In one screen, I have Zoom, and in the other side of my screen, I have my Gmail account opened up. I usually have two tabs open. One is so that I can see the assignments for my students from the previous week, and another is so that I can type up the assignments for this week that we're working on. In Fourscore, I keep all of my scores in here. After I purchase them, I download all of them into here. I have a folder for all of my online lessons, which has all of my students and all of the pieces they're currently working on. Something that can be really hard with teaching is when I was teaching in person, I would have the habit of leaning over my students so I could write notes in their music, which then they'd come back the next week and they would say to me, "Oh, I didn't see that," or "Oh, I forgot about that." But when they're writing in their own notes, they tend to remember better and tend to actually do something about that. But teaching online, it can be hard to communicate what you're talking about. So something I did recently with my student Ainsley is she's working on a sonatina, and there were a few sections that were difficult for her. So what I did, because I didn't want to spend lesson time having her make all of these brackets that you can see here and numbering sections, what I did, oh, I made a mistake over here. I should probably fix that. That should be section 1. What I did is I made these with her. In the lesson, she would instruct me where she thought they should go. And then afterwards, I went into my options up here in the top right, and I went to share and chose to share an annotated PDF. And I sent that PDF to her parents, which they were then able to share that with her so that she could write these sections in her music later. I do the same thing with fingering. We'll practice it together, and then I will send it to make sure that my students are marking the correct spots, because communicating can be difficult when you're communicating online and from a distance. Another tool I like to use when I'm teaching my students, there are options in Zoom to annotate on your screen, but what I prefer to do, since I have an iPad, I go back in, I share my iPad screen, and in here, I just opened a different application that has blank pages. I have a couple of these. One of them that I use is Onenote. I use Onenote mostly out of habit because I used to send piano lesson assignments through Onenote. But now I just use this to draw and annotate, sorry, not annotate, draw and explain concepts in lessons. So in this application called GoodNotes, there are different paper templates. I always keep it on notation on the staff so that I can come in here, and if I ever need to explain anything to my students, I can quickly toggle over here and say, okay, we're talking about A major versus A minor chords. And I would just like I did in this section right here, as I just quickly threw up a treble clef. I drew two different chords for my student to compare and had him play while I was comparing this. It can be hard, especially with beginner students, to show them what I'm doing with my hands. From this angle, especially because of all the backlight I have from my window behind me, it can be really hard for my student to see that I'm playing, finger number 4 with my left hand is on D. Even with my hand out of the way, it's so hard to see. So something that I found is an application called Droid Cam. There are YouTube tutorials about how to download this, but essentially I downloaded an app on my phone and I downloaded an app on my laptop, and I'm able to use my phone set up as a second camera. So to change this in Zoom, I go to where it says stop video. There's a little up arrow. I click on that and I go to video settings. And this took me a little bit to figure out, but what I needed to do was click on mirror video. So now you see I'm switched. And then there's a drop down for my camera and it just says Droid Cam. And I switched to my Droid Cam, and now you have a top view of my keyboard. One thing I worried about when switching to online lessons is that my lessons would end up becoming so boring for my students because we weren't playing games anymore, we weren't doing activities, we weren't able to get up and move, and they were stuck at their piano. And I was worried about saying, okay, let's march around the room, because if you ask a 4-year-old to march around the room, you might not see them again. So something I found, and I'm still looking, but one thing that I use in my lessons is I, again, share my iPad screen. And there's an application that I have called Note Rush. And this is just a flashcard game. And I use this with all of my students, even my advanced students, because there are options to create your own levels, and there are, you can say, okay, we're going to practice all the flats that you can see here, or with my young students, I'll say, like here with one of my students, we were just practicing the spaces on the treble clef. This does work through the computer. As long as my student has a strong enough internet connection, then all that we do is we just play this game like normal. They come in, they play that note, they play the next. Yes. Good, I can still read notes. One last thing that I found very helpful teaching my students online is I will often make practice videos for my students, or not even practice videos so much as I will say, okay, here's your new piece. We didn't have time to look at it today. I'm going to record it for you so you can play along with me when you practice. So let me show you the kind of videos that I created for my students. So this is my studio YouTube account. In here, I upload all of my practice videos for my students. I upload videos of myself playing, videos of my students playing, pieces that my students are practicing. I've recently started uploading improv videos for my students to play along with, because I've found that teaching online, I miss the connection of playing together, and so I wanted to create that for my students. So to do that, for example, let's see, there's something I forgot to do. When you share your screen, if you want your student to be able to hear it, at the bottom there's a little box that you can check that says share computer sound. I forget to do that a lot of the time. So anyway, now you can hear my computer sound. All I do is I pull up my YouTube and I say, okay, right now, let's work on some improv. Here's a video. Okay, so I'll pull up the video and I'll say, why don't you listen to this? Well, just listen to 10 seconds or so and tell me afterwards what kind of things you hear. So then I would play this for my student, they would listen, and then we would talk about what kind of things they're hearing. So I'll just show you a little bit of this. So anyway, it goes on, and my students get so creative and so excited about these things. And I asked one student the other day, I said, does this sound like anything familiar or anything relatable to you? And she said, it kind of sounds like a church song, but it also kind of sounds like a funeral. And I said, okay, that's interesting. I was teaching another student and I said, what does this sound like to you? Somebody suggested it sounded like a funeral. What do you hear? And he said, that's interesting. It sounds like Christmas, but there are dinosaurs there. And I said, okay, that's something else. Like, I haven't heard that. So I showed this to a different student and I said, I've heard all sorts of things. Can you tell me what you hear? And she said, I could see how it sounds like Christmas and definitely a funeral. So that's where we ended up, was a Christmas funeral song. But then anyway, I digress. So after I show this to my students, I have them play along with it on their own. Now the problem with this is because I can hear my computer sound, I cannot hear them play. So I ask my students during the week to have their parents record them, either video record them or record just their audio so that I can hear them improvising. Because I find that my students are like, okay, cool, I'll do it. But if there's no responsibility or no opportunity to share what they're doing, it's not as exciting for them. So that's my introduction to teaching on Zoom. If you have any questions, totally reach out to me. My email is mentioned below.